Continuing in a series this weekend that we are calling On the Pedestal. Connie started us off last weekend. Did she not do an incredible job kicking off this series about idols? And we got to honor moms and we got to talk about idols. And I tell you, that's a tricky subject to kind of honor moms and talk about idols. And so she did an incredible job doing that. And I'm excited about this series because I think this series is going to help us in a lot of ways. This series is going to be able to teach us about some things that we need in our lives that are going to be helpful to us. And Connie laid out a definition last weekend that she had read that I thought was perfect for this series. And we're probably just going to take this definition throughout this whole series of what an idol is. And an idol is anything more important to you than God. And we all have things that are more important to us than God at some points in our lives. And they're called idols. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. How many of us struggle with that on a daily basis? And anything that you seek to give you what only God can give you. So there are some things that only God can give you in this world, but we seek other things, people and things, to be able to give us that, and those are called idols. So I want to jump in to an account of one of the greatest heroes of our faith. No one would argue that he is a great hero of our faith. No one would argue that he is someone that we should watch and emulate and see how we can grow through him, and that is Abraham. How many of you remember Abraham? Father Abraham had many sons. Sons had father Abraham. Come on, that was a bop back in the day. You know it, back in your Sunday school days. But it's great bop. But the truth is, we find Abraham in Genesis chapter 21 with a promise of many sons. But what we find him with is actually just only two sons. One was a promised son from God. God had said he was going to give him a son. And then the other was a son that Abraham fathered through his servant Hagar. That was a mistake. That was a sin. Remember when we talked about Joseph back in our canceled series, and we said that Joseph, we talk about all of the great things he did, but we oftentimes forget that he made a big mistake. We look at Abraham, and remember, we just said Abraham is one of the greatest heroes of our faith, and yet he tried to take things into his own hands, and he did something that was a sin. He didn't wait on the Lord. He needed to wait, but he didn't wait. He'd have done better if he'd have waited. He'd have been stronger if he'd have waited, but he didn't do that. He went off and with his servant Hagar produced a son, and he and his wife Sarah had this grand idea. And so then they get the wrong things on the pedestal. When we put the wrong things on the pedestal, whether it's our own opinions or our own drive or whatever it is, we get things wonky. But then after that, Isaac is born. And by the way, this is what happens when you wait. Isaac is born. He's the answer to the whole promise that God had for him. And Abraham starts to get a little stronger because of it. And he sees that God is there for him. And so we catch up in Genesis chapter 21. The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. God always does that, doesn't he? He did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. You raised your hand during our worship just a few moments ago. And you said you had something that you were waiting on, something you needed some strength in. Can I just speak to that problem right now in your life and tell you that God is going to do exactly what he promised? Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't dial it in and go, I'm just not going to work on that anymore. No, God will do what he said exactly when he promised. And she became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. And this happened at just the time God had said it would. In other words, God is always on time. He's never behind. He's never like delayed in getting there. He's always on time. God's timing is perfect. Now, I know sometimes we hear not yet and we think that is a no, or we hear wait and we think that is a no. But it's not a no, it's just a not yet and a wait, because God, remember what Connie said last week, sometimes God is not waiting to move, he's waiting for you to mature. He's not waiting to move, he's waiting for growth to happen in you. And so wait is an answer from God sometimes, and says that Abraham named their son Isaac. And some stuff goes down with Hagar and Sarah in chapter 21. Who would have ever thought that, you know? Tell your husband to go father a child through another woman and think that you're not going to get along with her at some point. I don't know why Sarah missed that when she came up with her grand plan. But that's how it works. And so they have some problems. And this causes Abraham to tell Ishmael, his other son, and Hagar to have to leave his family land. But even in that, God promises to take care of Hagar and take care of Ishmael. But he says, but I've got a greater plan, and my greater plan is going to be through Isaac. But I was watching that, and I don't have time to preach this, but I think this will hit home for some of you. God is so good. He even takes the sin that we are still committing in our lives, and he cleans it up in a way that results in whole parts of your life that maybe bring you shame. Because Ishmael and the situation with Hagar, now that God has come through on his promise, would have brought Abraham shame. But God says, I'm going to take care of you too, to Ishmael and Hagar. He says, even your greatest mistake, Abraham, I'm going to take it and I'm going to turn it for good, because that's what God does. He brings beauty from the ashes. We think it's destroying, and God says, I still got something to do in there. I'm still going to work something. So just remember that when you've made some great mistakes in life, that God, when you begin to get in line and walk with him, can do some things even through your mistakes that you could never do through your greatest days. And so it's incredible. But this is where I want to get to. And it's hopping down to verse 12, actually. And God makes a promise to Abraham in verse 12. But God told Abraham, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. So God had already given Abraham a promise, and he delivers on it in the birth of Isaac, even when Abraham had doubt. But now he comes and says, Isaac will be the son who through your descendants will be counted. I want you just to file that away for a moment. God's already had a promise delivered. He's already made another promise, and I just want you to hold on to that, so don't forget about it. Verse 12, keep it in your mind. Say it out loud, verse 12. Coming back to that. All right, moving into chapter 22. Sometime later, the Bible says. Now let's stop there for a moment, because this is an important question. How much later? I'm going to ask for a lot of mental Olympics with me today. Hold on to that question too. All right, so you're holding on to verse 12. Say verse 12. You're holding on to how long? Say how long. In fact, you're probably saying, how long do I have to hold on to verse 12? Like you're probably doing it both. All right, so how much later? We'll see that in a minute. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. So there have been a lot of questions raised, a lot of sermons preached about this story. So much to be learned in this chapter of Abraham and Isaac's life. And I think we're going to learn a lot today as well. But one thing that we don't have to learn, because God says it very plainly and that we know for sure, is what was God doing in this story? Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. It's very straightforward what's going on in this story. It's very straightforward what God is trying to accomplish. God is testing Abraham's faith. And if God would test Abraham's faith, the hero of our faith, one that makes it into the hall of heroes in the book of Hebrews, one who we look to and say, oh yeah, he's the father of our whole faith. I mean, he's the father that we see the descendants of our faith coming from. If he would test Abraham, that leads me to believe that he would also test me. And if he would test me, that takes me to believe he would test you. And so what we can see in this is sometime God tested Abraham's faith, and we're going to learn about what God does when he tests Abraham's faith. But I believe it's sort of like a practice test for us. You remember the practice test? The test that your teacher told you, like, hey, here's the test. This is what the test is going to be like. So if you'll kind of study the practice test, you'll kind of know what to do on the test. Well, we get to read Abraham's life, and we get to go, this is the practice test. If God would test Abraham, I bet he's going to test me in some similar ways. And so what's on the practice test? Here's the first question. Abraham, God called. Yes, Abraham replied. When God calls you, the answer is yes. Then you find out the question. Did you notice that with Abraham? The very first question on the test was just, Abraham, yes, I'm here, God. What do you need? He had learned already that when God was calling him, he could trust. He was learning already that he could answer him. He could walk with him. He could put his trust in him. And so he sees it here. He says, Abraham. And he says, yes, God. So remember, an idol is anything more important to you than God. anything that absorbs your heart and your imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give you. Look at the next part. Here I am, says Abraham. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. So we know it's a test. And the test starts off with, will you answer when I call? And Abraham passes the first test. But then there's a second question on the test. It's not one of those one question essay tests that we had sometimes back in the day. It's a multi-question test. And he says to Abraham, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take something or someone that you love, someone in this case that you love, and I want you to take them and go to the land of Moriah. I want you to give me everything that you love. I want you to take the very thing that you probably have on a pedestal in your life. And I want you to give me what you have on a pedestal in your life. And God is asking that of not just Abraham, he's asking it of me. He's not just asking it of Abraham, he's asking that of you. He's saying, what is on the pedestal? What do you love? Because here's what I know about this story. There's only one position that God can be when it comes to the pedestal in your life. And that is first place. And that is the only one on the pedestal. That is priority. You've heard it said, you need to get your priorities straight. There's no such thing as getting your priorities straight. There's no such thing as priorities. There's priority. You can't have multiple priorities. How do you have multiple? You have one priority. What is my priority? And God says, I want to see that I am the priority on the pedestal in your life. I am, as Jesus called himself, the greater portion in your life. And he says to Abraham, I want to see what's on the pedestal of your life. And then God pushes in just a little bit more. He says, go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. He says, I want you to take what you love, what you have put on the pedestal. Because remember, God had made a promise, and now God was going to fulfill that promise through Isaac. But it wasn't just a promise to Abraham. It was his life. It was his legacy. It was what he would be. It was more than just a promise. It was what he was going to live out and what he would be remembered for. It was more than just a promise. It was something that was inside of him that he needed. And so now Isaac was the answer to everything. And so when something is the answer to everything in your life besides God, you will begin to think that that thing needs to be put on the pedestal. And that's what Abraham begins to do. As he begins to take what God had given him as a gift, and he takes the gift and he begins to make it God. And when we begin to take God's gift and make it God in our lives, that thing becomes an idol. That thing becomes something that absorbs our heart more than God does. See, words are the birth of a thought that was conceived. You can think God is priority in my life. You can think I would do anything for him. You can think he's first in my life, but when words are spoken out, or thoughts are spoken out rather to an existence, they become words. And what was in our minds now is not just conceived, but it is something that is spoken into existence. It is born. And when it is born, it becomes real. And when God speaks these words to Abraham, go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. All of a sudden, God had a thought. He wants to be first in your life. It becomes words, go and sacrifice, and it becomes real in that moment. And in that moment, you really see what's in the pedestal, what's on the pedestal in your life. And this is where I believe sometimes that we miss the point in this story. I think it's some of the point of this story. Abraham's resolve. I mean, we see Abraham's resolve, right? It's pretty incredible. I think part of the story is Abraham's passion. And we can get caught up in it. This is a story about Abraham's resolve. This is a story about Abraham's passion. This is a story about Abraham's stoic ability to put aside everything else and just follow God. God, I will do whatever you ask with no emotions. And so we see this story and we go, how can this man be confronted with taking his son, his only son, the one that you love, and God is talking about making him a sacrifice, and yet he stoically just pushes forward. How can this be? We have, I think, wrongly put an emphasis on these things, his resolve, his passion. I think we've put it on his obedience. And we said, hey, this is about Abraham's obedience. And in putting it on those things, I think we've actually had the potential cost of losing sight of what the story is actually trying to teach us. Because I'm not sure that what this story is really about is Abraham's resolve. I'm not sure that what this story is really about is Abraham's passion. I'm not sure that this story is really about Abraham's obedience. Because if it's about Abraham's obedience, then it's about compliance, right? I just comply with whatever God tells me. If it's about Abraham's stoic ability to be able to just walk through this, then really what it's about is, God, I just need to be in step with you all the time, so why don't I just comply with you? And compliance doesn't give us a God who loves us. Compliance gives us a God who controls us. And if it's a God who controls us, then we can't really love him, because in order to love him, we have to be able to choose to hate him. There is no love without hate, just like there is no light without darkness. And so he's walking not in compliance, not in just obedience. It's not simply about just obey. Isn't that what we tell people? Just obey. And just obey. Just do the right thing. Here, you need a list? I'll give you a list. Do these things. And so we come up with our list, and we come up with our things, and it gets strange, and it gets legalistic, and we go, if you'll just follow this list. But then people follow the list, and their hearts are still not walking with God. So God says, I don't want just compliance. I want to know what has absorbed your heart to a place where it's sitting on the pedestal and I'm not. So what is it that Abraham is trying to teach us? If we're sitting and Abraham as our professor this morning through the life that God walked him through, and we're sitting and we're saying, God, what do you want to teach us through the life of Abraham? What do we need to learn? Let's go to the next verse. The next morning, Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey, took 2 of his servants with him, and this is where we see that stoicness, right? And we think this is what it is. Abraham just got up early. He just went for it. He got up early. He just obeyed God, along with his son, Isaac. And then he chopped wood for a fire, for a burnt offering, and set out for the place that God had told him about. Now remember, the place that God had told him about was not even a place yet. Sometimes God will ask you to go somewhere and he doesn't even tell you where there is. Well, that's not compliance. How can I comply with directions to a place that I don't even know where it is? That's not just simple obedience. It's obedient to take the first step, but I don't even know where I'm going, God. So what is it that God is trying to see that is within us? What is God trying to teach us? And so we read this and we define for ourselves. We say, okay, Abraham had guts. And so we got to have guts. We need to have guts like Abraham and make bold moves. And so we see the Christian faith is all bold moves, walking compliantly with God, following the list, doing the right things. And we go, this is what I'll do. I will be perfect. And I'll do what God tells me to do. And I'll have no emotion in it. And I won't admit that there's struggles. And I won't admit, I just go forward. We need to be able to willingly sacrifice any and everything for God. That's what this is about, right? But there's gold in the next part of the story. And I think it actually changes the goal post, so to speak, where we want to get to and what God is calling us to and where we are to, what we are to gain from Abraham's experiences. Because remember, there was an obvious statement of what God was trying to do through this story. What was he doing? He was testing Abraham's faith. And then it says, on the third day. Now, I'd be a sorry preacher if I didn't stop there for just a moment. On the third day, come on somebody, don't miss that it was on the third day when this began to happen. Come on, so God likes to move on the third day. He likes to show up on the third day. A lot of people quit on Friday, but God shows up on Sunday. A lot of people are giving up in life going, I don't know if I can wait on God anymore to resolve this in my life. I don't know if I can put up with this relationship anymore. I don't know if I can walk through this anymore. And God says, hey, wait on the Lord. Wait till the third day, because on the third day, God begins to move. On the third day, stones begin to roll away. On the third day, he begins to show you what he's doing, Abraham. Abraham, just what? I told y'all I didn't have time to preach. Don't clap, because I'll start preaching. All right. On the third day of their journey, Abraham looked up. Always look up, by the way. The world will tell you to look down at yourself, look down on the pedestal. If you're looking down on the pedestal, that means you put yourself on the pedestal, by the way. And the scripture says, look up. Look up, wait on the Lord, and those who do will get their strength. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Stay here with the donkey, Abraham told the servants. Abraham knew this was something only he and Isaac could experience. This was one of those moments where he knew he was getting ready to have an encounter with God that needed to be him and his son. This is one of those moments where he had to, we call it, I just need to get away with God. I hope there are moments in your life where you're saying, I just need to get away with God. I can't rely on somebody else to meet my needs. I can't rely on friendships to meet my needs. I can't rely on my marriage to meet my needs. I can't rely on my money to meet my needs. I can't rely on food to meet my needs. I can't rely on my obsessions to meet my needs. I can't even rely on my joy to meet my needs. All I need right now is God, and he's the only one who can meet my needs. And if there's somebody or someone else on the pedestal that we are tempted to get along with, we'll begin to do that. And so we just got to say, God, I want to be the kind of person that gets along with you, and I'm going to take this test alone with you. And Abraham does that. And he gets up and he walks out the test with God. And the boy and I will travel a little farther. And look at this. We will worship there. What do you do while you wait? You worship. We will worship there. And then we will come right back. Everybody shout out, we. We read the Bible so fast sometimes that we miss what God is trying to say to us. It's not a race to see who can read the Bible in 1 year. That's not why God gave it to us. He gave it to us as a love letter from him to teach us every little detail about what we need to trust in. He shows us through little words. Remember, God crafted and put together every single way and every single word and every single step. And Abraham said these words, we will worship there, and then we will come right back. What do we need to learn from Abraham? It wasn't Abraham's tenacity and willingness to sacrifice. It was his trust and worship of a Savior. He says, we will come back down this mountain. Abraham never doubted that Isaac was going to come down the mountain with him, because what he had trust in God, who he had built his faith on. And so God is testing Abraham's faith. He wasn't necessarily just testing his obedience, though that is a part of trust. He wasn't necessarily just trying to see if he would comply. He doesn't just want compliant people. He wants worshiping people. He wants people who love him. He wants people in relationship with him. What he was testing was Abraham's trust of him. And who we trust is who we will put on the pedestal in our lives. And he needed to see where his trust was. The writer of Hebrews, when he would recap Abraham's life later in the hall of heroes, in the hall of faith, in Hebrews chapter 11, he says this, Abraham trusted God. Earlier in Abraham's life, he had said, Abraham, I want you to move somewhere. He said, where? I'll tell you when you get there. He said, all right, I'll go. He trusted that where God wanted to take him would always be better than where he had taken himself. Oh my goodness, do we believe that? Where God can take you will always be better than where you have taken yourself. But I love where I am. I love this season. I love the people that are around me. I love everything about this small group. I love this. I love this. I love this. But what if God is challenging you to go lead your own small group? What if God is challenging you to lead in a different area where you've built these relationships? What if God is challenging you to step out and to reach out to new people and to be different and to do something different in your life? What if God is shaking you up because where he wants to take you is always better than where you've taken yourself? And so he shows Abraham that. And Abraham had a decision to make, and this is the decision that we have to make. See, we are taking the test as well. Abraham had to decide what he was going to do with Isaac in this moment. And you have to decide. There's some things that are absorbing your heart. There are some things that get first place in your life. There are some feelings that take precedence over your faith. And you're allowing those feelings to be on the pedestal of your life rather than faith. And you're allowing the trials to be bigger than your trust. And God is asking us, just like he's asking Abraham, what are you going to do with Isaac? He's asking, what are you going to do with your idol? And if we've gotten this far and you don't think you have idols, can I tell you what your number one idol is? Pride. Because you don't even think you got any idols. So you know who your idol is? You. Because you think you're more trustworthy than God. And he's asking us, what are you going to do with your idol? And so he says to Abraham, you've got to decide with Isaac, pedestal or altar. Because everything that isn't of God will be either put on a pedestal and made into God, be a God, or it will be put on an altar and made into something that you can worship God through. Everything. And so he says pedestal. It was if Isaac was on the pedestal, then God was on the altar. And if you put God on the altar, you're sacrificing all that he has for you. You're sacrificing all that he can do through you. You're sacrificing all that he can bring to you. Because he's not meant to be on an altar. He's meant to be on a pedestal. If God was on the pedestal, then here's the other beauty. Abraham knew, Isaac's safe on the altar. If I put God in the proper place in my life, then I know whatever I put on the altar will be safe. If I put God in the proper place in my life, then I know whatever it is that drives for me to put them and have my affections be bigger for God, for them than for God, will be safe. I don't know what you think you are protecting by placing it on the pedestal, but you are actually putting it in the worst danger of it you could ever do. Anything you put on the pedestal in your life is in more danger than it could ever be if it's put on the altar and God is on the pedestal in your life. And here are the idols we struggle with. These are common kids. We think we're protecting our kids by putting them on the pedestal in their life, making them the center of our world, protecting them at any cost. All I do is look out for my kids. All I do is watch out for my kids. All I do is work for them. And so we put them on a pedestal and we think we're protecting them, giving them a life that they could have never gotten, but they could get a much better life if we would put them on the altar and be willing to say, God, they are yours. They're absolutely yours, because anything we put on the pedestal will fall, and when it falls, it will fall hard. So Abraham is working through this. I don't know, maybe it's job for you. Maybe your job comes first. One way to make sure your job doesn't go anywhere and where you don't ever get promotion, put it on a pedestal. Status. Connie talked about last week again, comfort. Spouses. Put our spouses on the pedestal. Now, I know some of you are like, I don't put my spouse on the pedestal. What are you talking about? Some of us, we put our spouses on a pedestal. I'm sorry, baby. I know I make it so hard for idol worship. I know it's hard. We put our spouses on the pedestal. We put family. Doesn't it sound so American to say, family first? Family is first. And Jesus said, he who won't leave his mother and his family doesn't even know how to follow me. What does that mean? Does that mean literally we have to leave them? Does that mean literally we have to hate them? Does that mean? No, it means if we put them on the pedestal, they will always let us down. Because what did Connie say last weekend? People make great spouses, great family, great friends, great bosses, great coworkers. They make awful gods. And when we have fear associated with a person, whether it's fear of, oh my gosh, my kids might get sick, my kids might die, my kids, or whether it's fear with a spouse, oh, he might leave me, he might desert me, she might hurt me, I don't know what they're going to do. If it's fear, Connie said, fear points us to, oh, I don't know what I would do without this friend. I don't know if I could make it without this friend. My life is not the same without this. Whatever it is, when we've put them on the pedestal, we've made them gods, and people are terrible at being gods. And it's a weight that they cannot bear. And so he says, I can tell you for sure, whenever you place something like Isaac on this pedestal, Abraham, it's not going to work out. And so if I'm going to build this whole faith on top of you, I've got to build it knowing you've got the priority on the pedestal. So back to the story. So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders. God is the master wordsmith, by the way. Is this not great foreshadowing? If you remember from English, foreshadowing, imagine Isaac with wood on his shoulders, and he's walking to his sacrificial death is what it looks like is going to happen. It's just foreshadowing Jesus, and it's showing us Jesus. And while he himself carried the fire, Abraham did, and the knife, as the two of them walked on together, they're walking together. I just see it. I see it in my mind that Abraham and Isaac is carrying the wood, and Abraham is beside him, and they're walking. Remember, this is how you walk on water. They're walking, and they're walking with God, and they're beginning to walk these things out. And it is a long walk to the place where God wants to test your faith. It is a long walk that they're making. And Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father, yes, my son, Abraham replied. We have the fire and the wood, the boy said, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? He asked a valid question. There would always be a sheep. They'd have the fire, they'd have the wood, they'd have the sacrifice. Everything was falling into line. Isaac wouldn't think anything of this. Everything was happening just as it should. Him and his father going to make this sacrifice by themselves was no kind of strange thing. This was happening, and he looks around, and he's confused just for a moment. He's confused about what's going on, and Abraham's statement, though, shows us something. Look at Abraham's statement. God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son. Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. This was the test. God will provide. I don't know how, but God will provide. I don't know when, but God will provide. I don't know what it's going to look like, but God will provide. He says, God will provide, my son, and then they both walked together. How did Abraham know this? How can we know this? How can we walk in this assurance? How, when we are tested, can we feel what Abraham is feeling in his faith and it to rise up and come out as trust? How do we do this? How do they do it? Because remember, what did I tell you to remember? Verse 12. I said, remember verse 12. What did God say? God told Abraham, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Whoever is our promise maker will also be on the pedestal of our hearts. Whoever we allow to make promises to us, that we count on their promises, that we put our trust in their promises, because our promise maker needs to be our promise keeper. And so if our promise maker is going to be on the pedestal in our lives, because that's who we look to. And Abraham was looking to God. He said, I remember, he told me, see all the stars in the sky? That's how many children are you going to have. That's how many descendants you're going to have. But then I didn't trust him, and I went out and did my own thing, and I sinned against God. And Abraham's like, I'm not doing that again. I've got a promise again. Verse 12, God told me he was going to be, Isaac would be who the promise was given through, and now I'm counting on him. And so when they arrived at the place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it, and then he tied his son, Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, this is an interesting part of the story. This is the part that I saw and was like, this is a part of what we need to learn. Do you remember back at the start of the story, I told you to remember 12? Everybody say 12? Saw that. But then I told you to remember a question. What was the question? How long? How long? Remember it said, sometime later. Let me show you something with a little help of my friends. I want to ask Mr. Bob Davis, would you come up here for just a moment? He's actually on this side. Mr. Bob Davis and Aiden, come up here for just a moment. You're both going to come up here on stage with me. I want to show you something because in this story, when most of us read about Abraham and Isaac, this is what we picture. Y'all come right over here. You're going to be my models for me. Model well, right? Model well. So this is Abraham. Now, I know you're not 120 years old, Bob, but you know, you're close. You're close. Yeah, you're getting it. And then we think this is Isaac. And so we read this part of the story, and it's like, all right, Isaac, so bind Aiden's hands. Just kind of pretend you're binding his hands. No trouble. Just get him out of his pocket. There you go. You can put them together. Pretty much wherever Mr. Bob would need Aiden to go, he's going to go, right? And this is the picture that we have of Abraham and Isaac. But I want to show you something because it says sometime later. There are some clues that go into this passage that show us how long was. How long was. So, Aiden, picture him carrying a big stack of wood on his shoulders. Not going to happen yet, right? Not going to happen yet. Imagine taking a 3-day journey together with a 120-year-old man, and you've got to help take care of him and get him up the mountain and stuff. Not going to be your best partner at this point in life. One day, but not yet. Imagine the fact that all these things to know about a sacrifice and even asking, well, I mean, when's the sheep going to show up? And knowing how the sacrificial system plays out and what that means to even have a sacrificial system. And you may not even know that, but they sacrifice so that they could make amends with God. It was to pay for sin, and so they would sacrifice. And so Isaac knew that. That's because we have gotten it all wrong. Y'all thank Aiden for a minute. Aiden, you come over here with me for just a minute. You come this way. And Kaylin, come up here for a minute. Going right down there, if you will. Kaylin, come up here. This is actually what Isaac looked like. So historians tell us Jewish rabbis for all of the history have believed that Isaac was about 37 years old when he's making this story. Didn't you always picture? How many of you, you were today years old when you realized Isaac was not this big? You've seen it in we do a disservice sometimes in children's Bibles, by the way. We leave out all the Noah story. We leave out stuff. And so we've got this little Isaac. But now, I think there was a day. I know there was a day when you could take him. I know there was. But that day has passed. That day has passed, right? That day has passed. This is a man-child right here, if he's a child, all right? And so try to bind his hands. I mean, just try and move him if you can. I mean, just try to make him do something. No, he can't do it, right? And so there's this picture we have of this compliant, remember compliant? We have this compliant Isaac who's like, I mean, honestly, theologians and historians have even asked the question sometimes of like, I mean, wouldn't this have been child abuse? Like, would Isaac have been on a chair with a psychiatrist for the rest of his life about what his dad did to him? But there's a whole different part of the story, and it shows us something about our relationship with God, because Isaac was able to say, you're not tying my hands. Isaac was able to say, I'm not carrying any wood. Isaac was able to say, I'm not lying down on an altar. What are you talking about, Dad? You must have a 120-year-old disease. You must be thinking something's wrong, right? You've gotten a little long in the tooth. You don't know what's going on. And he could have easily pushed Abraham away. But what we need to see is that Isaac, not compliantly, but willingly took himself to an altar. Thank these guys for helping me out to show this. Now, here's what I don't want you to miss. We're learning something about what God was doing. Not only did he look for the trust in Abraham, but he looked for the trust in Isaac. He looked for the willingness. And remember the foreshadowing? There was a willingness in which Jesus walked to the cross. There was a willingness in which he was bound and spit on and beaten. I always say Jesus wasn't killed. He willingly put himself on, and died on a cross. And we have to see the sacrifice in this, that Abraham is showing us his trust. But there's also some beauty, and a beautiful part of this story is that Isaac trusted his father and his God so much that he will allow himself to be put on a pedestal. So for Isaac, too, it was an altar of trust. Isaac wouldn't allow himself to be on the pedestal. He knew, I trust my dad. And you know that was a long walk. Dad, where's the sheep? God will provide the sheep. Son, come here, let me bind your hands. All right. God will provide the sheep. You want me to get on this altar? I don't even think Abraham could have gotten him on the altar by himself. He willingly crawled onto the altar. God will provide. God will provide. Over and over, they must have been thinking as they were walking, God will provide. But God can only provide when he's on the pedestal. This was a moment where Isaac shows us that what true sacrifice is when we sacrifice our own lives. When as Romans 12:1 says, and so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. This is when worship begins to happen. This is when I lay myself down on the altar, when I am willingly saying, I will not only will I not put anything else on the pedestal, I will not be on the pedestal. Selfishness can be our greatest idol. When we put ourselves up on the pedestal, and he is saying, I will not do that. My worship is my altar. My life is my sacrifice. And I will sacrifice everything. And the beauty of where we live now in the new covenant is they used to have to kill something. There used to have to be a death. There used to have to be bloodshed to make right with God. But Jesus came and he said what? Tetelestai, it is finished. And now when we lay ourselves on an altar, it's an act of worship because everything that God will do, when we sacrifice ourselves, everything that we will do, that God will do with our lives is better than what we could do. So how do I kill the idols in my heart? I bring all of me to the altar. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. And at that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, yes. Abraham replied, here I am. Don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son. Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. The ram, instead of a sheep, it's a small little detail, but the ram was an adult male that was unblemished. Jesus would be an adult male who was unblemished. Scripture's so good. God was so good. He had a ram come out instead of a sheep to show us that a final sacrifice would come one day in Jesus. And then look at this. And Abraham named the place Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. And to this day, people still use the name as a proverb. They even sing it in churches all over the world, the Bible should say. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The Lord will provide. A long walk to the place, the Lord will provide. A long wait on God, the Lord will provide. Abraham taking the knife up, thinking the Lord will provide. The test was not about compliance or obedience. The test was about trust and faithfulness, because you are enough. And so I wonder if we could take the pedestal and we could examine it just for a moment. What's on the pedestal in your life? What have you put on the pedestal that's more important to you than God? And what we have to do is we have to remove it, take our own lives as a living sacrifice along with that thing or that person, and we lay it at the altar, which allows us to be in a position to be able to see what needs to clearly be on the pedestal and to say to God, you are enough. You are enough to walk me through this pain. You are enough to get me through this season. You are enough in every way that I need. Everything else that you give me abundant and beyond yourself is just extra because you're good and you're generous. You are enough. And Abraham, in that moment, he knelt and he said, Jireh, you will provide. You are enough. What is in your life right now that you need to get off the pedestal so that you can clearly see? Jireh, more than enough. Sing it to him. Jireh, you are enough. You are enough, God, right now in my life. In every content, I'll be content.
In every circumstance.
In everything that's circumstance. Because you are enough.
You are enough.
Oh, sing it to him. Sing it, sing. Jireh, you are enough. It's not obedience, God. It's not simple compliance. I want you to absorb my heart. It's not just walking in a way that I've written out in legalistic lists. It is a love affair that I'm having with you because you are my provider. You are enough. When you're ready, why don't you just stand and give him everything that you have, telling him, you're enough. You're enough. Jireh, you are enough. What do you need to lay down? Give it to him right now. Tell him it's all yours.
In every circumstance.
Oh.
Jireh, you are enough.
Laying down relationships, laying down finances, laying down marriages, laying down kids, laying down spouses, laying down opinions, laying down dreams, and saying, God, if you're not enough, I don't know what will be. So I need every bit of you, because I want to be content.
Jireh, you are enough.
Yeah. Come on.
Jireh, you are